Okay. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Tommy Soares. I'm the Assistant Director of the Purdue Institute of Inflammation, Immunology and Infectious Disease. And today I have the honor and pleasure of welcoming John Snyder from Elanco, Principal Research Scientist and Group Leader in Discovery Virology and Biopharma. John, it's such a pleasure having you on for our inaugural Pathfinder program, where we seek to connect with scientists and industry and perhaps provide a link with our grad students and postdoctoral community that want to learn more about what are the scientists' role in industry, and perhaps what are some of the opportunities right here in our doorstep in Indiana, in different types of companies that we may not know about just because we're all wrapped up in our own work in our own world at Purdue University. So thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. And, we're really interested to hear a little bit of your story.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tommy.
So without further ado, I would love to get going and get to know a little bit about your background, and maybe get started with what's your training? Where did you go to school? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tommy. So I'm actually kind of Midwest, born and bred. Did my undergraduate at Purdue and studied molecular biology. This was in the late 90s, early 2000s, so several years ago. And like many kind of undergraduates, I did a significant amount of undergraduate research when I was at Purdue, and really had an appreciation and enjoyment around trying to do research as a long-term career. And so I knew as I was leaving, or getting ready to leave, I should say, kind of my undergraduate career at Purdue, that grad school was likely in my future. And kind of my last semester at Purdue as an undergrad, I was fiercely kind of applying for graduate schools, getting the letters of recommendation in order, and trying to think about what's next. And I happened to get this piece of mail in my actual mailbox. This is dating how old I am. We actually used to get mail from the department at the time. And there was this announcement that this company called Abbott Labs, which is a big pharmaceutical company in Chicago, was coming down, and they wanted to kind of recruit both undergraduate and graduate level students. And so I thought, well, I'll go to this session. I'll kind of learn about Abbott and about what they do. And I attended this evening session, and there was an individual who was also a Purdue alum named William Phillips. And that name may ring a bell because William, or Bill, as he's known more often, has left a generous donation to the department after his passing a couple of years ago. But at any rate, Bill Phillips came down, and he really was passionate about the role that a scientist could have in industry. And so I left 90 minutes later after this session, really having almost a conflict inside me. I had thought for years and years and years that graduate school was what I was going to do. I was laser focused on doing that next after an undergraduate. And this passion that Bill and his team had about the ability that one had to impact people's lives by being in industry really resonated with me. So long story short, I, on a whim, kind of applied for a role at Abbott, and was very fortunate to get a role after I graduated at Abbott up in Chicago, where they're headquartered. I worked on the diagnostic side at Abbott, and really thinking about in vitro diagnostics and the tools and instruments that are used to help doctors and clinicians kind of understand, is there any disease state apparent in individuals that are having their blood tested, for example, and kind of building those reagents and building those tools. And I loved what I did because I did indeed have the opportunity to work on projects and work on platforms that were commercialized, that were launched, and that were really helping people and clinicians make decisions to keep themselves healthy and keep themselves living long and healthy lives. However, I will say with just a bachelor's degree at the time, there was a glass ceiling for me scientifically. Now, I could have gone into quality assurance or regulatory or marketing or things of that nature, but I wanted to be an individual that kind of directed the science, directed the direction of where we were trying to innovate. So I decided to go back and get my PhD. I decided to go back to Purdue and get degree number 2. So I came back to Purdue in 2007 and was fortunate enough to join the laboratory, excuse me, Dr. Richard Kuhn. Many of you may have heard that name and his contribution and his lab's contribution to infectious disease and virology in particular. And I really had a passion for understanding how something that seemed so inert, so simple, so basic could cause so much disease, so much morbidity, and so much disruption, as we've all experienced, firsthand over the past 2 years. And so I worked with Dr. Kuhn for about 4.5 years, working on the structure of viruses and how the virus particle assembles from host components and viral derived components and really forms a virus particle, and trying to understand how we could learn more about that virus formation, virus assembly, and even virus disassembly. I was fortunate because I had the opportunity to really add to my kind of scientific toolkit with some really fundamental skills that I think are really important for a scientist, agnostic to if they go to industry, to academia, but certain techniques around protein biochemistry, protein expression and purification, and characterization, molecular biology, and just a really fundamental toolkit. So I had a great time at Purdue again, and at Dr. Kuhn's lab. And like most PhD graduate students, one of the often next step is to think about a postdoctoral fellowship. I knew based on my time at Abbott that I had really developed a passion for being in industry, for the opportunity that industry offers to try and change the world and make it a better place by helping people. And so I tried to bias my postdoc opportunities to those that had kind of an industry type focus. So I was fortunate enough to find an opportunity that was kind of a joint hybrid industry academic postdoc fellowship between Roche, the large Swiss pharmaceutical company, and the Mayo Clinic, the large hospital system up in Minnesota, and had the opportunity to go up there and work on hepatitis B and really try and work on a project that Roche was interested in to understand how to better develop screening tools for hepatitis B antivirals. And so I was very focused at the time on, I wanted to be in industry. And I thought that the only kind of opportunities in industry for a virologist were on the human health side. And so I was kind of gearing myself up towards, realistically, I may end up on one of the coasts, Boston, the Bay Area, or San Diego, because that's where a lot of the big pharma was. But I happened to be in the lab or in the office of the lab one day up at the Mayo Clinic, and I saw this opportunity at a company called Elanco here in Indiana, based in Indianapolis, for a molecular virologist in industry. And it kind of checked the boxes for me. It was in the Midwest again. I wanted to apply my academic training and learnings in virology to something in industry, so it checked that box as well. But it was in the veterinary pharmaceutical company. And I had never heard of the concept or appreciated the concept that there was a need for medicines and other solutions to keep animals healthy and living longer lives as well. But nevertheless, it sounded like an interesting opportunity, an opportunity for me to continue to play in virology. So on a whim, I applied and was given the opportunity to come to Elanco. I've been at Elanco for about 7 years now. Elanco actually at the time was part of Eli Lilly. In fact, Elanco is an acronym for Eli Lilly and Company. And we recently spun off into an independent company outside of Lilly about 3 years ago. Like I mentioned, we're a veterinary pharmaceutical company. We're really charged with developing solutions to keep animals living longer and healthier lives. And so those solutions entail things like therapeutics, vaccines, diagnostics, solutions for parasites, and even solutions around data as well, and how we can use data to keep animals healthy. Really our vision is making life for animals makes life better. And what that means is, of course, our solutions can keep our cats and dogs at home healthy. They can keep our what we call kind of our farm animals, our production animals happy as well, swine, cattle, poultry. But also it helps make us better, make the world better by providing happy pets. Pets are a huge part of our family nowadays. They're companions just as much as the rest of our family. And of course, when we think about the large degree of animal-based protein that's consumed around the world, making those solutions more productive, more efficient, and more sustainable is a big part of what we do. So like I said, I've been at Elanco about 7.5 years. I started out putting on the lab coat and the safety glasses and going back into the lab every single day, and had the opportunity to work in the infectious disease space. And as I've been here, my responsibilities, I guess, scientifically, as well as both on the leadership level, have kind of grown. And so over the years, I've been given more and more responsibility, to the point today where I kind of lead one of our early discovery biologics teams. And so what we're tasked with is thinking about ideating, designing, architecting, and ultimately engineering new solutions using protein-based drugs. So therapeutic monoclonal antibodies, vaccines, engineered enzymes, gene therapy solutions, anything where we can think about using a biologic as a drug. We're tasked with innovation in that space for our species of interest. So that's, in a nutshell, Tommy, kind of my journey and kind of what I'm doing now.
That's so cool. What an awesome and interesting journey, John. I had no idea about the stint that you did in between your bachelor's and your PhD at Abbott. How long was that period of time?
Yeah, so that was about 3 years, and it really gave me the opportunity to kind of dabble in industry and, like I mentioned, understand and appreciate the power that one individual can have through kind of their multiplicative efforts, to deliver products, deliver solutions,
Yeah,
to help the world.
that's awesome. And I mean, 3 years, that's like you almost did grad school before grad school. That was your master's degree. You could pretty much call it, right? Like
Yeah.
for some, I know I did a master's, and I know some of the people on the call might have done a master's degree, but this was almost like an experience like that where you just spent that time in industry getting your feet wet there too. Um, John, tell me something. Was it the excitement that you knew you were doing something that was closer to making an impact that you think really got you excited to work in industry? Meaning, when we're doing work in academia, we're so at the early stages, at the basic stages of the work, that we very rarely get to enjoy the victory of having something that actually goes out into the marketplace and impacts people's lives. Is that what drove you? Is that what really inspired you to continue to work in industry? Is that the feeling that you still have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a feeling that I developed at Abbott and then continue to refine in the past few years at Elanco. And it's really this opportunity, as you alluded to, Tommy, to think about kind of seeing a concept from, we like to say from cradle through graduation, and being able to watch what happens to these ideas as they are attempted to be turned into products, attempted to be kind of commercialized and launched and get out there, and help, in our case, help animals, help people. I will say that, being very early in the discovery space, the vast majority of our ideas, they fail. One of our mantras is we want to fail fast and we want to fail often, because we know that it's not straightforward to take any given idea and turn it into a drug or turn it into a solution. And so we want to kind of set ourselves up for being as pragmatic as possible about de-risking these ideas, increasing their probability of success as early as we can. But when we reach a roadblock that we think is intractable, being comfortable with saying, okay, we're going to move on, we're going to try something differently, and not keep trying to go down that rabbit hole, if you will. But yeah, back to your original question. Yeah, I mean, I think just the opportunity to kind of see the fruits of my labor, the fruits of my colleagues' labor, turn into these products and translate into these products, to me was just really powerful and kind of part of my personal why.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can imagine that feeling, especially if you know that the work that you're doing is really having that more direct impact. John, it must have been different when you when you put on your lab coat in industry versus the time that you did it so in a Purdue? And I probably, comparable your PhD time with your time when you did your postdoc, and maybe even further down. So after Roche at Elanco, and what can you tell us a little bit what that was like? Was it a difficult transition? Was it easy? How what were some of the uncertainties that you had before getting into that role?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, one of the things I tried, the opportunity that I had at Abbott was to, as I kind of saw, incoming new scientists, whether at the junior level or at the kind of senior level, the kind of post PhD level, I kind of saw what success looked like in terms of what skill sets they were bringing, what connections they were bringing, and just what good looked like in terms of people that were coming into industry and then succeeding in industry. And so I tried to kind of model, at least on the technical side, what I was learning in graduate school, such that I could apply that to industry. And like I mentioned earlier, there was, several just kind of fundamental, toolkits, if you will, that I think aid, success no matter where you are in industry. Myself as a biologist, our currency is protein and protein-based drugs. And biologic drugs. And so fundamental understandings in terms of protein biochemistry, molecular biology, cell biology, I really tried to make sure I had the opportunity in graduate school to learn as much of those kind of fundamentals and theories as possible, knowing that those would be directly translatable no matter kind of which way I went in the future. And so from that kind of technical perspective, I think that I had prepared myself. And I think in general, most graduate students would be prepared to go into industry. I mean, I think there are certain, caveats. There are certain things that maybe I didn't know about industry when I was in academia, or maybe didn't appreciate, that I can touch on as well. But it's,
Please
yeah,
do so. Let us know what are some of those things.
yeah.
We're totally curious about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think so, a few different things. I think one is really, I didn't appreciate before coming to industry, particularly at Elanco, the complexity of developing a drug. It's really easy in the lab and in academia to kind of establish a proof of principle. But translating that into a product is really complex. And in general, like I mentioned, has low probability. We're failing all the time for various reasons. There's really 4 fundamental questions we always have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about developing a drug or developing a product. First and foremost, is it safe? That is the number one question: is the solution we're going to offer safe to, in our case, to the animal, but safe to the patient? That is paramount. Of course, the second question is, does it work? And we have certain, criteria that we have to meet from an efficacy perspective. All the data we use to develop a drug are published in some form or fashion. And so it's readily available for clinicians and others to go out there and compare our drug to the current standard of care, or just to see if it works. And so it's not always easy to translate something from an in vitro model, an ex vivo model, a preclinical rodent model into our target species or into man. It's doesn't always work as well as we think it will. The second is maybe a couple other dimensions that I didn't appreciate as much from the safety and efficacy side. That is, can we make it? We have to ask ourselves, can we make it? Some complex, synthetic synthetic steps, or some complex upstream manufacturing process that maybe is easy to do at a lab scale, but very complex to do at a commercial scale, may not add a lot of value, may not have the right margins, or might have the right cost of goods to allow us to be able to make that from a cost-effective perspective. We also have to think about, of course, intellectual property and freedom to operate, and making sure we're not infringing in that regard. And so just there's a lot of dimensions around, can you make it? And then, of course, the fourth question is, can you sell it? Just because you have a drug that's safe, that's efficacious, that you can manufacture, if the current market for that therapeutic area is already very much entrenched, or if you don't have a lot of differentiation from what's already established, It's hard to kind of speed adoption of your drug as well. And so you've got to make sure that you are enabling solutions that people actually want. And so that was another maybe red or another kind of piece of data I didn't appreciate in academia as well. I think there's a few others. When I was in academia, I was kind of thinking about what I was going to do the next day or the next week in terms of setting up my experiments or putting together a project plan. We really think on kind of the time horizon, or our time horizon and scale is in terms of quite often years. So, right now we're planning studies or experiments that might not be happening until 2023, for example. And so it really requires the ability, or I didn't appreciate the ability that is needed to, be able to manage more than a few weeks in advance, to kind of think about holistically larger project plans and how my work really ties into the work of others and is part of a larger endeavor to de-risk a drug. With that in mind, I think patience is required as well. We are a very collaborative environment. And so we have to rely quite a bit on others to get their job done. We have to rely on making sure we're doing the right experiments and collecting the right data and analyzing the data in a very detailed way. And so being patient to know that, unlike in grad school where I could kind of control the cadence and speed of my own work, and I was to some degree my own boss, that's not necessarily the case in industry. You're really relying on your teammates and others to move things on. I think maybe there was a few kind of myths as well about industry that I had assumed when I was in academia. I thought that industry would be a blank checkbook, an unlimited source of funds, and that's not necessarily the case. I mean, we do have large R&D budgets, and we don't necessarily want for equipment or other things, but our costs are extraordinary too. The number of preclinical and clinical studies that are required to develop and license a drug are large. The costs associated with that are expensive. And we really have to prioritize. We have to deliver. And so we can't work on every idea. We have to really focus our efforts. And so although we have a significant amount of funds, those funds get utilized and get deployed pretty regularly. Another thing I wasn't used to was having to budget dollars and budget costs. That was something I didn't worry about at all in academia. And here I have to make sure really, and particularly as a group leader, I have to concern myself with making sure we're applying the best use of the operating capital that I'm allocated. So I've got to make sure that we get the most efficiency, from a project advancement perspective, from a de-risking perspective, out of every dollar. And I think if, what else? I think, the science that I'm working on. So I am trained as a molecular virologist, as I kind of mentioned on the introduction. The science that I'm working on is to some degree only tangentially related to what I was trained on. So most of the work that I do is thinking about, therapeutic antibody drugs for oncology or for pain or for inflammation, these disease states and these molecular modalities that I wasn't necessarily trained on in academia, but I have to work on and have to become familiarized with myself as well. I would say, the technologies that we're trying to bring online internally to aid our discovery efforts, these are new technologies, or they didn't even exist when I was in graduate school. So RNA vaccines or single cell sequencing or having a next gen sequencer on your benchtop. These are things that were, to me, at least pipe dreams. It's really my point is, every day, every month, I have to keep myself up to date on new data, new publications, new molecular modalities, new techniques, not only to keep myself contemporary and up to speed, to make sure that I can ideate new solutions and add that value to my group, add that value to the company. I think finally, probably the biggest thing that I didn't appreciate, Tommy, when I was in academia versus industry is that, at the end of the day, one of the things I like to say is that, customers don't care what's inside the bottle of medicine. They care that it's safe. They care that it works. They care that they can afford it. So with that in mind, I am just, and my team is just as much engineers as we are scientists. Really, our goal is to kind of construct solutions that enable the biology our customers need by leveraging and bringing together, different technology stacks to build something that's never existed before. And so we have to really apply just as often that engineering mindset or engineer mindset as a scientific mindset. And that's something that I just had never wrapped my head around that I would be doing someday when I was in academia, really kind of focused on just getting my next experiment done, was this kind of engineering mindset.
That's really interesting. And so in that respect, when you're working with others in industry, right, in your setting, it sounded to me from the way you described it like you have two cogs on a wheel that are dependent, and you're dependent on others and others are dependent on you to make things kind of work. And but at the same time, you're keeping up to date with the field. You are growing as a scientist. It sounds to me like you didn't just stay the specialist that you graduated as, but you've expanded in your knowledge and in your field. Um, it, it, Working with each other, do you, like, if you read a paper, do you send it to your team and they read it and you guys discuss it? Does it still happen in a similar way, like we have lab meetings or we have, seminars and papers, presentations, defense presentations? We're always in this mode in academia of a seminar and going to talk to this person and just constantly talking to each other. Does that happen, or is it a little bit more quiet? Is it a little bit more competitive? There's a little bit more of that edge in industry.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Tommy. I would say, kind of answer in two different dimensions. One is that kind of scientific sharing and getting excited about, as a group, kind of appreciating the latest manuscript in the primary literature, or the latest, conference abstract. That still very much happens in industry. So, group meetings, journal club, attending conferences, exactly the same for us as when I was in graduate school and postdoc and academia in general. Because ultimately we have to keep ourselves up to speed. We have to keep learning from what's being published, and learning together. And to kind of your cogs in the wheel question and related to this, I think collaboration is just a huge part of what we do, and that's probably a huge part of success as a scientist in industry is being able to effectively collaborate. I mean, we have kind of our local functional group. So I talked about kind of my discovery biology group that thinks about protein-based biologic drugs, but we also have project teams. And so those project teams are comprised of subject matter experts in a wide variety of different areas: safety, our preclinical efficacy, regulatory, DMPK, so on and so forth. And so, a typical project team in the discovery space where I sit might approach 10 individuals sitting on that project team. And as that project advances and gets de-risked and moves into development, those project teams could be 20 or 30 people large in terms of contributors. And so, no one person is equipped to succeed alone. It's just the fact, no matter where you are, and particularly in industry where the questions we're trying to answer from a scientific and from a regulatory perspective, frankly, are that much more complex, that, being able to succeed in industry in one dimension, at least, absolutely requires the ability to collaborate, and to collaborate well. That collaboration involves, being comfortable acknowledging that quite often there's those in the room that are smarter than you. Collaboration involves being challenged often, having your ideas critiqued. But that collaboration really allows us to realize that paradigm, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so fundamentally, and then maybe that's another piece of data, if you will, that I didn't appreciate in academia, because we tend to be a little bit more kind of individual contributor focused, is the magnitude and degree and the ultimate requirement of kind of, intramural and frankly extramural collaboration that's required. kind of coming back to your what's, do we have journal clubs? Do we have, lab meetings? Yes and yes. We also collaborate quite extensively with academic partners too. And maybe that's something that's not quite seen or is appreciated as much as we like to say we're agnostic to the source of innovation. Clearly, we have a team kind of inside the walls of Elanco and Lilly thinking about new ideas, new products, but we're cognizant that there's great solutions outside those walls in biotechs and in academia, for example. And so we do a huge amount of work with academic partners, including partners at Purdue, frankly, to help us de-risk new ideas, access technology platforms or technology stacks we haven't built internally or don't think we can build internally. And we have that kind of same academic collaboration as well.
That's awesome. And so that means that you're still working with students, with postdocs, with people within the university infrastructure. That also, it's interesting, and we could go into that part of the conversation, which could be very interesting too, of how things do work with the different times and timing in industry, timing in academia, cultural differences, and so on and so forth. But one thing that you said that I think is important to understand is, you said, oh, well, the funding comes a little bit easier, or we're able to tap into it, but you still have to defend it. You still have to write a proposal. You still have to, probably not as extensive as an NIH proposal, but do you still have to propose every time you would like to get some funding to go after a research project? And one question that I think a lot of us have in academia is, how frequently do projects start and how frequently do projects end? Like, how, if you've guys have decided, well, we've tried that one enough and now it's time to put it away and start something new or head in a different direction, how frequently does that happen? And is that disruptive? So maybe a few questions there: the money part, and then the change of directions part question.
Yeah. So, I mean, change of directions, it depends on kind of where you sit in that R&D, the R&D kind of cycle, if you will. We kind of like to envision in our heads this concept that if we have a goal of, let's say, launching one product a year, just hypothetically, we know that the probability of success for any given project matures as it goes through the development life cycle, because we're de-risking it along the way. We're de-risking it from a efficacy perspective, from a pharmacokinetic perspective, from a CMC perspective. And so as we're getting closer and closer to development, the probability of launching that program goes up. And so the amount of kind of rework or triage is less as you're getting closer to commercialization and regulatory approval. But at the same time, what that means is if we have a goal of launching one product a year and the probability of success is not 100% or 1.0, that means we have to be working on multiple projects or product concepts at a given time. And the reality is, as you kind of go back into the early development and then into the research and then into the kind of discovery space, that means your work in progress kind of has to grow and grow and grow, because your really early discovery projects have a really low probability of success. And so as you want to be able to make sure that at least one of those makes it to launch, you have to be working on quite a bit of substrate. So it's a long-winded way to say, in discovery, there's quite a bit of kind of project turnover, because again, we're trying to fail fast, we're trying to fail often, so that we can take these concepts, and if it doesn't meet those criteria of, safe, efficacious, can we make it, can we sell it, then we move on. So it kind of really depends on where you sit. In the discovery space, my team may be working on, so I've got a team of around probably 15 total. We might be working at any given time on 7 or 8 different projects. And in a 12-month window, maybe 2 or 3 of those projects will kind of turn over. And that's just kind of the world I live in. Every company is going to be different. But there is, in the discovery space, at least where I sit, there is a lot of turnover. Part of that can be because we failed scientifically. Part of that could be because we got scooped from a product perspective, not a publication perspective, but somebody else launched a product ahead of us. We saw that the market opportunity or the value proposition of that program kind of went down, and so we'll stop it. Or sometimes what can happen is there's a strategic change. Elanco, for example, we decided recently that kind of our microbiome type initiatives were large enough to spin out into a new company. And so we spun out a company recently for all of our microbiome work. And so that means a lot of those projects internally, they're now external. So it kind of depends on where you sit in terms of that project kind of churn. Now, with respect to kind of the funding question, any kind of company, any industry is going to have kind of a scientific oversight and governance that makes sure that we are kind of working on solutions for the highest value kind of therapeutic indications, or the biggest unmet needs, or the biggest markets. And so when we have a new idea, in general, the idea is we kind of assemble a dossier, if you will, around why we think this particular idea is worthwhile from a scientific perspective, from a market value perspective, and from an overall kind of probability of success perspective. And these ideas are kind of de-risked first with a set of scientists, and we go through and we kind of critique and pick apart and refine that idea. And then we kind of present it to a management board and say, this is an idea we're seeking, frankly, both approval to work on to begin with, as well as the associated funds. And quite often the way it'll work is we're not getting, when that project is approved, we're not necessarily getting $50 million for the next 3 years, but we'll do what's called incremental funding or earned funding, where we will get funded, if you will, to the next major scientific milestone. So that milestone could be go through a lead optimization process and show that your small molecule has an acceptable PK profile. Or for a vaccine, it could be run a pilot serology and immunogenicity study and show that you're able to generate a potent immune response. Or for a monoclonal antibody, it could be show that it has the right IC50 and the right affinity. And so we kind of then go back to that governance board and say, okay, we've met this milestone. We want to run these next set of studies. Please fund us. Or quite often, again, we fail fast, we fail often. We go back and say, this experiment didn't work, or this asset didn't work. We do think we can mitigate it. And here's our, we like to say research is called research because you're continuously retrying.
Yes.
Or we may say, listen, we think there's some fundamental liability with the concept or with the molecule that we need to start over, and we go back to the drawing board. Now, with all that said, our general kind of rule is this 80-20 paradigm, where kind of 80% of what we're working on is this kind of official, above the table, everybody's aware of it. There is a very, I would say, kind of implied and approved decree that 20% of what we're working on should be those kind of blue ocean, moonshot type ideas under the table. And we're lucky to have the kind of discretionary funding and discretionary OpEx to be able to do some of those kind of behind the curtains type work. And that's the funnest part.
That's awesome. But that's only your department, right? You can only do that in a discovery department. You can't do that in a shipping department.
Right.
No, but that's really, really neat. I love that that it's still, you still have to sell the idea. You still have to sell your team. You have to sell the science. You have to sell, you have what it takes to accomplish this. It can't just be pie in the sky type of idea, even though you might have some of those, bubbling here and there in the background, projects like that. So interesting. And John, I'm gonna open it up so that the grad students and the postdocs that are on the call here can also have an opportunity to ask questions and so on. I just wanted to make sure that we captured, because you did touch on this in several places, but so that we can really capture your advice for what really makes a successful scientist in industry, and what is it that a scientist coming out of academia uh, should should be prepared to do? What are some of the concessions that you should be prepared to do, and what are the things that you shouldn't be prepared to do? And I know, like, if you go to Purdue, any lab, any building, there might be somebody there in the middle of the night working through their project and doing their thing. That's not the case at Elanco, is it? Can you just go show up any time of the night to go check on your cells and stuff like that? Or is there more regimented timing for when things happen and so on and so forth?
Yeah, no, great set of questions, Tommy. I mean, I think if one wants to come in on the weekends or at nights, that's fully welcome and appreciated. But the reality is we try and really embody a work-life balance in industry. We're cognizant of burnout, particularly after the past 2 years. And we want to make sure that people are being able to be safe physically and be healthy physically, be safe psychologically. And so there is this kind of expectation that we're taking care of ourselves first and foremost. And then that leads to people that are happy and productive. And so I would say, definitely, like, I'm sure there's many grad students on here that spend nights and weekends passing cells and inoculating mice. We try and do a little bit less of that in industry, again, just to keep people happy and healthy. With respect to success, I mean, I think that, success in industry is, I mean, there's some similar dimensions, but also maybe unique dimensions about industry in terms of success. We are an industry where ultimately, driven by delivery, delivery of a newly launched product, delivery of a research candidate to that next scientific milestone, like I talked about, delivery in terms of, creating a new platform. But I think ultimately at a high level, that's not much different than academia. We still have to deliver in academia, whether that's a manuscript or a conference abstract or things of that nature. But maybe the currency of delivery is different. For us, it's a product as opposed to a manuscript or a grant. So I think in industry, one's ability to successfully contribute to that product, and it's what we're here for. And so success really comes with being able to do a few different things, being able to establish a pragmatic kind of what we call a flow scheme or a decision tree to really de-risk as early as possible, and to at the same time trying to increase the probability of success of an idea or of a drug lead or of a drug candidate. And so I think by extension, success is related, to understanding and appreciating how to address the right questions at the right time. To be able to make a decision on a platform or on a drug concept, that decision more often than not, particularly in the discovery space that I sit in, is to stop something as opposed to continuing to work on something. And quite often we have to make decisions without having all the data, which for a scientist can cause a huge amount of anxiety and can induce, stress when we don't have a lot of data, but we're being told you have to make a decision now because some other considerations. So I think really, risk tolerance and risk appetite tends to need to be quite high in industry. And so I think success is associated with that as well. And I think just in general, I think no matter where you are, the demonstrated ability to influence inside and outside the organization is correlated with success. We like to say that leadership is influence. No matter if you have 50 people reporting to you or you're an individual contributor, if you can successfully influence your team, your peers in the organization, you're being successful. And so I think with that comes, establishing a footprint that you're trustworthy, you're knowledgeable, that you can articulate your position well to others, that your opinion is well regarded and well sought, that others really kind of, desire to collaborate and establish a coalition or a partnership with you. Those are kind of all indicia of success and the ability to influence. And so I think ultimately, one way that people kind of see successful scientists in industry, but probably in academia too, is really establishing yourself as a partner of choice when it comes to influencing, collaborating, and working together.
That's awesome. Well said. And I think that type of advice resonates wherever you go. Because at the end, to solve complex problems, we need to work with people, and we need to rely on them, and we need to be reliable to them, right? I really like that, that it continues, and maybe it sounds like there could be even more camaraderie happening in industry than the individual thesis, individual project, right?
Yeah.
I see Jennifer Hensel has her hand up and she would like to ask a question. Please, Jennifer, unmute yourself and go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, John. Thank you for your talk. I just have a question. So how often are you responsible for sort of coming up with your own project ideas, or does that come from, over your head? You said you're in the field of oncology. So do you, get to say, okay, I want to target, this project in this way, or does that sort of come from over your head?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think there's to kind of give some perspective. So what we establish is a corporate strategy in terms of therapeutic areas that we're interested in working in. So it could be a certain infectious disease. It could be, like you mentioned, oncology. It could be inflammation. And then within those therapeutic areas of interest, we start to establish what we call target product profiles. So for a certain malignancy or tumor type, or for a certain infectious disease, these are the attributes that the solution must have from, again, that cost perspective, safety perspective, dose frequency, dose schedule, things of that nature, just kind of all the properties of what that successful drug would look like. And that's as much kind of instruction as we get. We then get to go to the whiteboard and again, be those engineers that say, okay, for this particular indication, we want to use this particular platform or molecular modality. We think a small molecule will work best. Or for this particular indication, we think that a bispecific antibody would work best. And so again, it kind of brings back that, anecdote. I talked about being an engineer or a set of engineers. We really get to define as kind of that discovery unit what the solution might look like. Because again, our commercial organization, our marketing organization, to some degree, the regulators, they don't care what's in the bottle. They care we're checking the boxes that it's safe, it's efficacious. And of course, we can make it, we can sell it. And so we get to kind of come up with how we find the solutions to those, again, what we call target product profiles.
And John, you have other departments that you can depend on to make your case. Like you can say, hey, what would it cost to do this? And can you help us create a little model for how we would be making this particular compound or whatever it might be?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tommy. I mean, not only do we have those partnerships, but we can use those partnerships. We have to use them. I mean, again, we are not expected to appreciate how to build a CMC cost model for a small molecule manufacturer. My team has other experts and partnerships in that space. Same thing on the regulatory side, or the safety assessment side, the preclinical model side. We really have to go out and say, okay, we have this drug concept. How are we going to de-risk this from a efficacy, from a DMPK, from a cost perspective? And that's part of building those coalitions or those project teams really early on. That is a fundamental necessity of what we do, is getting the right people in the right room at the right time to ask those kinds of questions.
Awesome. John, we always hear, and I'm generalizing, or we do hear sometimes that when people go into industry and they're really good at something, and they get really good at something, that's all they end up doing is just that particular task. So let's say in your group, if you know that somebody is really good at recombinant protein expression, man, we're going to give you a few more constructs to help us with because we know you have the magic touch. And so sometimes those people are just golden to have in a company setting where they can just churn out the same thing over and over again. In academia, it's very difficult to do that because people just want to discover and people want to continue that innovation piece, right? And so, how it does it happen very often that people get entrenched into doing one particular job, and that stifles their potential to keep growing? And is that at all a concern for a scientist that is thinking about going into industry?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, Tommy. And that's something as individuals are kind of interviewing companies. And so I say that because when you're going through an interview, you should be interviewing that company and the people just as much as they're interviewing you. That's one of those questions you want to ask. I would say in general, most industry, I'm not going to speak, universally for all industry, but based on the companies I work for in terms of Abbott, and Lilly and now Elanco, a big part of what we want to do is develop our people and enable them to become the scientists, become the employees, become the contributors they want to be. There are some individuals that when we have this kind of development planning discussions, so get a bit more granular, kind of what we do each year with our team as we sit down and kind of map out what's your kind of 5-year plan in terms of where would you like to be in 5 years, and what are the experiential opportunities both inside and outside of Elanco we can give you over the next few years to try and make you realize that opportunity. Now, there are some people that raise their hand and they say, listen, I love sitting in front of the FPLC, playing on unicorn software
Yes.
and purifying protein all day. Those people exist, and that's fine. And that's part of the development plan is maybe we teach them how to use a new chromatography modality, for example, or get them to some learning opportunities outside. There's other people that are very vocal about they want to kind of be a scientific leader or scientific manager someday. And so we try and construct development plans to enable that piece as well. There's other people that say, listen, I love putting on the lab coat right now, but I don't think I'm going to love doing that 5 years from now. But I would love to learn about regulatory and what it takes to convince the regulatory agencies that we do have a safe and efficacious drug. What are some experiences I can do, maybe some short-term assignments or other things I can do to gain exposure there? And so we kind of sit down and map those out with our staff and try and find out what do they want to do and how can we make it happen.
Yeah, that's great. And it takes a little bit of confidence, right? Just to take that leap and continue growing. But if we are not continually growing, then what's the point, right? We get depressed. We start going the other direction. I see Pranshul Sardana has a question also. Please go ahead, Pranshul.
Yeah, hi. I'm a PhD student in the mechanical engineering department. And the biggest problem I see in West Lafayette is that I don't meet enough people from industry. And I would like to see some industrial applications of my work. And right now, I don't know the pain points. So I have a two-part question. Like one, how can I meet relevant people? What can I do right now? And two, what other things I can do, and other than meeting people, that can help me move into industry after 3 years when I graduate.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think to kind of your second question about what you can do outside of simply meeting people is try and research what are certain destinations, certain companies, or certain other employers that are of interest to you. Learn as much about those employers and start to think about what's the kind of talent they're looking for. Start to look at why is the reason you want to work for that company. And the reason I mention that is quite often when we're looking at people that have applied for roles, of course, people they'll send in their CV, they'll send in their cover letter. I go straight to the cover letter right away because I want to understand, why does this person want to work for Elanco? Why are they passionate about the kind of work that we do? how do they think they can contribute to the kind of work we're doing? So I say that just from the perspective of trying to learn about what are some of those destinations. And then that brings it back to kind of this people perspective of, trying to leverage as much the kind of resources that you have with your kind of academic advisor, postdocs, or building an internal network at Purdue of people who may know people on the outside, and really trying to and I used to hate when people told me this, but it's a reality, is building your network as much as possible, whether at conferences, whether via LinkedIn, whether it's kind of researching professional organizations, and in your case in the mechanical engineering space, and trying to build a network that way. That is a huge way to get your CV to the top of the pile, frankly, is building that network connection. I think the other piece is, if you don't see that some of those kind of connections between Purdue, mechanical engineering, and some of these industries exist, I mentioned throughout this talk, collaboration and building coalitions, an opportunity to sit down with some of your peer graduate students and try and build a professional networking organization of Purdue mechanical engineer graduate students and, Cummins and Cook and other kind of, engineering firms in the Midwest, or even in Indiana. It looks great on your CV as well. And it's another opportunity to try and build something that hasn't existed before, and build a team around that.
I agree. I think that's great and a great advice. I wanted to ask you, are you guys at conferences all the time too? Is this a good medium for someone like Pranshul to go and talk and ask questions? That's where I would go, right? A conference like Bio that's so big and has anybody and everybody there. It's a good way to start meeting people, giving away your card, talking to them, exchanging emails. Even going and sharing a meal with people at a conference is a great way to meet new people. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. And we try and attend and sponsor conferences as much as possible. If there's any virologists on the line that are going to the big American Society for Virology meeting in Madison this summer, Elanco sponsored a large portion of that, and we do that quite a bit. And obviously, Elanco is life sciences oriented, but I think industry in general, whether it's on the engineering side, the ag side, the biology, the chem side, those delegates, if you will, from industry are quite often at the big academic conferences, in addition to the professional conferences.
Jonathan Snyder, Dr. Jonathan Snyder, thank you so much for taking time, giving us a little bit of your wisdom, sharing with us some of your story and your perspective. Principal research scientist at Elanco, group leader for virology and biopharma. Thank you again for taking time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invite, Tommy, and thanks everybody for participating. Hopefully somebody learned something new that they didn't appreciate coming in 60 minutes ago. That was my goal today, was to maybe plant one seed and maybe water it a little bit, and then let it germinate in the future. And so thanks, Tommy, for this initiative. And
absolutely. And I know you planted my seed. Definitely. It's great. And I want to welcome everybody to come back and join us again on May 5th for another Pathfinder program interview, where we'll be discussing and talking to Vivek Badweg from, he's an analytical scientist at Corteva. Looking forward to speaking to him. Thank you again. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John, and have a great evening.
absolutely.
See you
Thanks,
soon.
everybody.